The prison transport vessel moved through the darkness of space like a silent predator, carrying its cargo of the condemned across star systems that stretched beyond human comprehension, and inside the cold metal belly of this flying dungeon sat Kyle Bennett, with his hands shackled and his spirit unbroken despite everything the Galactic Council had done to crush him. Kyle was 28 years old with brown hair that had grown too long during his months of captivity, and eyes that still burned with the fire of defiance that had gotten him arrested in the first place, and he sat in his cell staring at the walls that hummed with energy barriers designed to keep prisoners exactly where the Council wanted them. 6 months ago, Kyle had been an engineer working on Earth's first deep space colony construction project, and he had been good at his job solving problems that others said were impossible, and making systems work in conditions that would kill most people. But that life felt like a distant dream now. The Galactic Council had arrived on Earth with promises of friendship and cooperation, and they had offered humanity a place among the stars, if only Earth would agree to certain terms, and those terms included giving up sovereignty, accepting council law, and providing labor for their mining operations across the galaxy. Most of Earth's governments had been ready to sign, and they saw the advanced technology, the promise of protection from hostile alien species, and the chance to explore the cosmos, but Kyle had seen something else in the fine print of those treaties, and he saw slavery dressed up in diplomatic language. He had spoken out at the public hearings, and he had shown people the clauses that would give the Council control over Earth's resources, its military, and eventually its people. And he had organized protests and convinced workers to refuse Council contracts, and for that act of rebellion they had arrested him. The trial had been swift and brutal, and Kyle stood before alien judges who looked at him like he was an insect that needed to be crushed, and they asked him if he would recant his statements and accept Council authority. And Kyle had looked them in their various eyes and said no. That single word had sealed his fate, and they sentenced him to life imprisonment in the mining colonies of Kragoth 7, where prisoners worked until they died, extracting rare minerals that powered the Council's war machines. And no one ever escaped from Kragoth 7, and no one ever came back. Kyle sat in his cell counting the days until they reached that hellish rock, and he knew he had maybe 72 hours of relative freedom left before he would be underground forever. But he did not regret his choices because some things were worth dying for, and human freedom was one of them. The ship carried 200 prisoners from dozens of different species, and Kyle had learned to recognize the sounds of the various aliens through the walls, but 3 nights ago a new sound had joined the chorus of misery, and it was a sound that did not belong on a prison transport. It was crying soft and musical like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, and mixed with it was a low rumbling that vibrated through the metal floor, and Kyle had pressed his ear to the wall trying to understand what he was hearing. The guards had brought someone new aboard at the last station, and Kyle had heard the commotion as they dragged the prisoner through the corridors, and there had been shouting in languages he did not understand, and the distinct sound of energy weapons powering up, though they had not fired. Curiosity drove Kyle to the front of his cell where he could see through the energy barrier into the dimly lit corridor beyond, and 3 cells down on the opposite side. He could make out movement in the shadows. He waited until the guard rotation changed, and the new guards settled into their posts before he whispered into the darkness, and he asked if anyone could hear him, and if they could understand his language. For a long moment there was only silence, and then a voice answered him, and it was like nothing Kyle had ever heard before, clear and pure, with an accent that reminded him of ancient poetry. The voice said yes in perfect English, though the pronunciation was slightly off, and it asked who he was and why he was imprisoned, and Kyle felt his heart racing because he had not expected an answer, let alone one so articulate. He told her his name and his story, keeping his voice low so the guards would not hear, and he explained about Earth and the Council and his refusal to let his people become slaves. And when he finished, there was another long silence. Then the voice spoke again, and it told him a story that made his rebellion seem small by comparison. And the voice belonged to Luna, and she was a princess of the Silver Moon clan from a world called Etheria, where ancient forests covered entire continents, and magic flowed through the roots of trees older than human civilization. Luna's people were the elven race, and they had refused to join the Galactic Council thousands of years ago. and they had isolated themselves on their forest world living, in harmony with nature, while the galaxy around them descended into corporate greed and endless war. But the Council had found something on Etheria that they wanted, and deep beneath the sacred forests lay deposits of celestial crystal, a substance so rare and powerful that a single gram could power a starship for a century, and the Council demanded the right to mine it. The elven clans had refused, and they said the crystals were part of their world's life force, and removing them would kill the forests and eventually the planet itself. But the Council did not care about elven beliefs or environmental concerns, and they wanted the crystals, and they would take them by force if necessary. Luna had been chosen to negotiate with the Council because she was young and idealistic, and her people hoped she could find a peaceful solution. But the negotiations had been a trap, and the Council had no intention of compromising, and they arrested her on false charges of terrorism and conspiracy. That was not the worst part, and Luna's voice dropped to almost a whisper as she told Kyle about her companions. And she had not come to the negotiations alone, and with her were 2 dragons, the last of their kind. Kyle felt his breath catch in his throat, and he asked if she meant real dragons like from Earth's old stories, and Luna laughed softly and said yes. Though these dragons were young, barely more than hatchlings. Their names were Ember and Ash, and they had been born from eggs that Luna's grandmother had protected for 1,000 years, and dragons had once filled the skies of Etheria, but the Council had hunted them to near extinction centuries ago because dragon scales could be used to create weapons of incredible power. These 2 hatchlings were precious beyond measure, and they represented hope that dragons might fly again someday. But now they were prisoners like Luna, and the Council planned to kill them and harvest their scales. And Luna would rather die than let that happen. Kyle listened to her story and felt something stirring in his chest. And it was not just sympathy for another prisoner, but a recognition that Luna represented everything he had been fighting for, and she was fighting for her people's freedom, their right to live as they chose, and their connection to something greater than profit and power. He asked Luna what the dragons looked like, and she described them in detail. And Ember was red and gold with scales that shimmered like fire, and eyes that glowed with inner warmth, and Ash was silver and blue like moonlight on water, with wings that whispered when he moved. They were small now, no bigger than house cats, but they would grow if they survived, and someday they might be large enough to carry riders through the clouds, but that future seemed impossible now. And in 3 days they would reach Kragoth 7, and Luna would be executed, and her dragons would be dissected in some Council laboratory. Kyle made a decision in that moment, and he decided that he would not let that happen, and he did not know how he would stop it, and he had no weapons, no tools, no allies, and he was just one human against an empire that spanned galaxies. But he would find a way. He told Luna to hold on, and he told her that humans were good at doing impossible things and that he would get her out of this. And he heard her soft laugh again, and she asked how one shackled prisoner could possibly rescue anyone. Kyle smiled in the darkness of his cell, and he said that was what the Council had asked about Earth, and they had thought humans would just surrender and accept their place as servants. But they had been wrong about that, and they were wrong about him too. Luna was quiet for a moment, and then she thanked him, and she said it had been a long time since anyone had offered to help her, and that even if he failed, she would remember his kindness. But Kyle had no intention of failing, and he began to study everything around him, looking for weaknesses in the ship's systems and patterns in the guard rotations and anything he could use. And he had 72 hours to figure out how to break out of an escape-proof prison ship and rescue an elf princess and 2 dragons. The impossible had never stopped him before, and it would not stop him now. Kyle spent the next 12 hours doing what humans did best when faced with impossible situations, and he observed and analyzed and looked for patterns that others might miss, because engineering had taught him that every system had weaknesses, and every machine eventually broke down. The prison ship was old, and Kyle could tell that from the way the lights flickered during power cycles, and the way the ventilation system coughed and wheezed like it had a respiratory disease. And old systems meant old programming, and old programming meant predictable patterns. He watched the guards carefully, and there were 6 of them on this shift, and they were a mix of species, including 2 Krillians with their insectoid bodies and clicking mandibles, and 3 Vorthans who looked like walking reptiles, and 1 human collaborator who refused to make eye contact with Kyle. The human guard bothered Kyle the most because he represented everything Kyle despised, and here was someone who had sold out his own species for a paycheck and a position of minor authority in the council's hierarchy, and Kyle wondered what it took to make someone betray their own kind. The guards followed a strict rotation, and they walked the corridors every 30 minutes, checking each cell and scanning for signs of tampering or escape attempts, and they were thorough. But they were also bored, and boredom made people sloppy. Between the guard patrols, Kyle studied his cell and the energy barrier that kept him contained, hummed with a frequency he could feel in his bones, and he knew enough about energy fields to understand the basic principles, but the Council's technology was far more advanced than anything Earth had developed. Still, technology was technology regardless of who built it, and all energy systems needed power sources and regulators and cooling mechanisms, and somewhere in this ship, there was a generator feeding power to these barriers, and generators could be overloaded. Kyle examined every centimeter of his cell looking for access panels or maintenance ports, and he found what he was looking for behind a vent cover near the floor, and it was a small opening barely large enough for his hand, but through it he could see conduits and wiring that connected to the barrier system. He tested the vent cover carefully, and it was secured with screws that were designed for alien tools. Not human fingers, but Kyle had learned long ago that desperation made humans creative, and he broke off a piece of metal from his bunk frame and used it to slowly work the screws loose. It took hours and his fingers bled from the effort, but finally the vent cover came free, and Kyle carefully set it aside and reached into the opening, and he could feel the heat from the conduits and smell the ozone from the electrical systems. Through the wall he could hear Luna singing softly in her cell, and it was a song in the elven language that he did not understand, but the melody was beautiful and haunting, and it spoke of forests and starlight and a world that still believed in magic. Kyle whispered to her, and he asked if she was all right. And Luna stopped singing and replied that she was trying to keep Ember and Ash calm because the dragons could sense her fear, and it made them agitated. He asked what would happen if the dragons got too agitated, and Luna said they might breathe fire, and that would alert the guards and probably get them all killed. And Kyle made a mental note that fire-breathing dragons on a spaceship were definitely a complication he needed to plan for. Luna asked Kyle if he had really meant what he said about rescuing them, and there was hope in her voice mixed with disbelief. And Kyle told her yes, and he was working on a plan, and he just needed to figure out a few more details. She asked what kind of plan, and Kyle explained that he was studying the ship's power systems, and he thought he could cause an overload that would disable the energy barriers, but only for a few seconds, and in those seconds they would need to move fast. Luna was quiet, and then she said that a few seconds was not much time, and Kyle agreed but said that humans had won wars in less time than that, and sometimes all you needed was one perfect moment. He asked Luna if her magic would work on the ship, and she said yes, though it was weaker here in space, far from the living forests of her world, but she could still call upon the power of nature, and she could make plants grow even where no plants should exist. Kyle thought about that, and asked if she could grow plants from the ship's water recycling system. And Luna said possibly, if there was organic matter in the water, and Kyle smiled because there definitely was, and ships like this recycled everything, including biological waste. The idea forming in his mind was crazy even by human standards, but crazy ideas had saved humanity more than once. And Kyle began to explain his plan to Luna, keeping his voice low and checking constantly for guards. He would overload the power system using the conduits in his cell, and that would cause a cascade failure that would shut down the energy barriers for exactly 3 seconds, based on the reset cycle he had been timing. And in those 3 seconds they needed to get out of their cells, Luna would use her magic to grow vines and roots from the water system and create obstacles for the guards, while Kyle fought his way to her cell, and together they would reach the escape pod bay that he had memorized the location of during his transport to the ship. The escape pods were small, only meant for emergencies, but they were fast, and they had enough fuel to reach the nearest station, which according to the star charts he had glimpsed was a place called Freeport. and Freeport was neutral territory, where the Council had no official authority. It was a long shot, and there were a million things that could go wrong, and they could be killed in the escape attempt, or they could make it off the ship only to be recaptured, or they could reach Freeport and be turned over to the Council anyway. But doing nothing meant certain death. So really, they had nothing to lose. Luna listened to his plan, and when he finished, she said it was the most insane thing she had ever heard, and coming from an elf who lived in a magical forest that was saying something. And then she said she was in, because insane was better than dead. Kyle asked about the dragons, and Luna said they would follow her commands, and Ember and Ash were young, but they were smart and fierce, and they would fight if they needed to. And Kyle said that was good because they would definitely need to fight. He spent the rest of that day preparing, and he worked the metal shard from his bunk deeper into the wall cavity until he could reach the main conduit. And he tested the connection carefully, making sure he could create a short circuit when the time came. The guards came through on their rotation, and they glanced at Kyle's cell but saw nothing suspicious because he had replaced the vent cover and hidden his work. And they moved on, and Kyle waited until their footsteps faded before going back to work. Through the walls he could hear other prisoners, and most of them had given up hope, and they sat in their cells waiting for whatever fate the Council had planned for them. But Kyle refused to give up, and giving up meant accepting that the Council was right, and that individuals did not matter. He thought about Earth and wondered if anyone there was still fighting, or if the governments had signed the treaties and surrendered, and he hoped that somewhere people were still resisting and still believing that freedom was worth fighting for. Luna called to him softly, and she asked about his world and what Earth was like, and Kyle described blue oceans and green forests and cities that reached toward the sky, and he told her about mountains and deserts and the way sunset looked over the Grand Canyon. She said it sounded beautiful, and Kyle said it was, and that was why he could not let the Council take it, and Luna said she understood because that was how she felt about Etheria, and they were fighting for the same thing even though they came from different worlds. Kyle asked what Etheria was like, and Luna painted pictures with her words, and she described trees so tall they pierced the clouds, and rivers that glowed with bioluminescent fish, and meadows filled with flowers that sang when the wind touched them. She told him about the dragon riders of old and how they had soared through the skies protecting the forests from invaders. And she spoke of the great libraries where elvish scholars had recorded 10,000 years of history, and the crystal caves where she had found Ember and Ash's eggs. It sounded like paradise, and Kyle understood why Luna would rather die than let the Council destroy it, and he promised her that if they survived this, he would help her save Etheria. And Luna laughed and said that was a big promise from a human she had never even seen. Kyle said that humans were good at keeping promises, especially impossible ones, and Luna said she was beginning to believe that, and together they continued planning their escape into the night, while the ship flew on toward Kragoth 7 and their deadline grew ever closer. The second day passed in careful preparation and nervous waiting, as Kyle refined his plan and memorized every detail he would need to survive the next 48 hours, and he knew that timing would be everything, and even a second of hesitation could mean death for all of them. He watched the guards more carefully now, and he learned their individual patterns, and the Krillian guards were precise and methodical, checking every corner of every cell. But they were also predictable, and they always looked in the same places in the same order. The Vorthan guards were lazier, and they often skipped cells or gave only cursory glances, and they spent more time talking to each other than actually doing their jobs. But they were also more heavily armed and quicker to react to threats. The human guard, whose name Kyle learned was Peter Collins, was the wild card, and Peter walked the corridors like a man haunted by guilt, and his eyes darted nervously, and he jumped at every sound. But he also carried the access codes to the escape pod bay, and Kyle had overheard him complaining about having to run diagnostics on the pods. That piece of information was crucial, and if Peter had access to the pods, then getting past him might give them a direct route to escape. And Kyle began watching Peter more closely, looking for weaknesses he could exploit. Luna continued to practice her magic in secret, and she would whisper words of power, and Kyle could hear the strange rustling sound of plants growing in impossible places, and vines had begun creeping through the water pipes, creating a network of living matter throughout the ship's infrastructure. The dragons were getting restless, and Kyle could hear them moving in Luna's cell, and their Claws scratched against metal and sometimes small jets of flame would light up the darkness, and Luna had to constantly calm them with soft words and gentle touches. Kyle asked her if the dragons understood what was happening, and Luna said yes in their own way. And dragons were ancient beings with wisdom that transcended language, and Ember and Ash knew they were in danger, and they trusted Luna to protect them. On the third morning, Kyle woke to find the ship's rhythm had changed, and the engines were decelerating, and he realized with a jolt of fear that they were approaching Kragoth 7 earlier than expected, and his timeline had just been cut in half. He called out to Luna and told her they needed to move tonight, and waiting any longer meant they would be separated and sent to different parts of the prison complex, and Luna agreed. And she said the dragons were ready, and so was she. Kyle spent the day making final preparations, and he loosened the conduit cover completely so he could access it quickly, and he tore strips from his prison uniform to wrap around his hands for protection, and he did exercises to keep his muscles ready for the fight ahead. The hours crawled by like years, and Kyle felt his heart pounding in his chest as the moment approached, and he had been in dangerous situations before, but never anything like this, and never with so much at stake. Luna sang again that evening, and her voice drifted through the corridors like a prayer, and the other prisoners fell silent listening to the haunting melody, and even the guards seemed affected, pausing in their rounds to hear the elvish song. Kyle recognized it as a battle hymn, and Luna had told him about the songs that elvish warriors sang before going into combat, and they were songs of courage and sacrifice and the belief that some things were worth dying for. When the guard rotation changed at midnight, Kyle knew it was time, and Peter Collins was on duty, along with one Krillian and one Vorthan, and this was the smallest crew and the best chance they would get. Kyle removed the vent cover and reached into the cavity, and he grabbed the main conduit and pulled with all his strength, and the metal pipe came free from its housing with a screech that he hoped the guards did not hear. He wedged the pipe against the secondary power line, and sparks began to fly as the two systems connected and created a feedback loop, and Kyle could feel the electricity building, and the air crackled with energy. The lights throughout the ship began to flicker, and the guards noticed and started moving toward the power junction to investigate, and Kyle waited, counting seconds in his head, and the power buildup needed to reach critical mass before it would trigger. The safety shutdown. Luna was chanting now, and her voice rose in volume, and Kyle could hear water pipes bursting as vines exploded through them, and roots cracked through floor panels, and suddenly the corridor outside was filled with living plants, growing at an impossible rate. The guards shouted in alarm and started firing their weapons at the vegetation, but the plants kept growing and wrapping around their legs and arms, and the Vorthan guard went down tangled in thorny vines that tightened. Like constrictors, Kyle jammed the conduit harder, and the buildup reached critical, and the ship's emergency systems kicked in, and every energy barrier throughout the cell block shut down simultaneously for exactly 3 seconds while the system reset. Kyle burst from his cell, and he ran into the corridor where chaos reigned, and the Krillian guard turned toward him, raising its weapon, but Luna's vines wrapped around the creature's arms and pulled them down. Peter Collins stood frozen in shock, and his weapon hung limply at his side, and he stared at Kyle with wide, terrified eyes. And Kyle did not want to hurt him, but he could not let Peter stop them either. He lunged forward and grabbed Peter's weapon and twisted it from his grip, and Peter fell backward, hitting the wall, and Kyle expected him to sound the alarm, but instead Peter just sat there breathing hard. Kyle ran to Luna's cell and saw her for the first time in person, and she was beautiful in a way that took his breath away, and her silver hair seemed to glow with inner light, and her violet eyes were filled with fierce determination. Beside her crouched Ember and Ash, and the dragons were exactly as she had described them, and Ember's red and gold scales shimmered like living fire, and Ash's silver and blue coloring made him look like he was carved from moonlight, and both dragons bared their tiny fangs at Kyle until Luna spoke to them. She said something in Elvish, and the dragons relaxed, and then she grabbed Kyle's hand. And her skin was cool and smooth, and she said they needed to move now because the energy barriers would reactivate in seconds. They ran through the corridor, and vines parted before Luna like curtains, and the dragons flew alongside them, their small wings beating furiously, and behind them, Kyle could hear alarms blaring as the ship's security systems detected the breach. More guards were coming, and Kyle could hear their footsteps pounding on metal floors and weapons being charged, and he knew they had minutes at best before the entire ship's complement of guards converged on their position. Luna threw her free hand forward and spoke words of power, and suddenly a wall of thorns erupted from the floor, blocking the corridor behind them, and the guards slammed into it, cursing and trying to cut their way through. They reached a junction, and Kyle checked his mental map of the ship, and the escape pod bay was 2 levels down and 3 corridors over, and they needed to get there before security locked down that section. An elevator shaft stood open before them, and Kyle looked at Luna, and she looked back at him, and without words they both understood what needed to happen, and they jumped. The fall should have killed them, but Luna's magic cushioned their descent, and vines grew from the walls, slowing their momentum, and they hit the bottom level hard but alive, and the dragons spiraled down after them, chirping in what sounded like excitement. Kyle's ankle screamed in pain, but he ignored it, and they ran limping through corridors that were now filled with flashing red lights and automated warnings in multiple languages, and the ship knew it was being hijacked and was trying to lock down. They burst into the escape pod bay and found it empty, and 6 small pods lined the wall waiting for emergencies exactly like this, and Kyle ran to the nearest one and started the activation sequence while Luna kept watch. The door at the far end of the bay exploded inward, and guards poured through, and weapons fire lit up the space, and Kyle shoved Luna into the pod, and the dragons followed her, and he dove in after them as energy bolts scorched the air where he had been standing. He slammed the door and hit the emergency launch, and the pod's engines fired, and they were thrown back against the seats as the pod shot out of the bay like a bullet from a gun. Through the small viewport, Kyle could see the prison ship receding, and guards were running to the other pods, trying to follow, but Luna raised her hand, and the vines she had grown throughout the ship all activated at once. The prison transport shuddered as vegetation choked its engines and wrapped around its weapon systems, and the ship began to list too. One side powerless and confused, and the other escape pods could not launch because their systems were compromised. Kyle set the coordinates for Freeport and engaged the autopilot, and then he finally allowed himself to breathe, and they had done it. Against all odds, they had actually escaped. Luna was crying and laughing at the same time, and the dragons were curled in her lap, purring, and Kyle realized he was shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion and disbelief. He looked at Luna, and she looked back at him, and her hand found his and squeezed it, and she said thank you in a voice filled with emotion. And Kyle said they were not safe yet, but they were free. And that was a start. The escape pod was cramped and barely large enough for 2 humans, let alone 1 human, 1 elf, and 2 dragons. And Kyle found himself pressed against Luna in a way that would have been awkward under normal circumstances. But right now, he was just grateful to be alive. The pod's life support system hummed quietly, and a small control panel displayed their course and estimated arrival time, and they had 6 hours until they reached Freeport, assuming nothing went wrong, and Kyle tried not to think about all the things that could still go wrong. Luna was examining Ember and Ash carefully and checking them for injuries, and the dragons seemed fine, though Ember had a small burn on his wing from where he had gotten too close to an energy. Bolt and Luna touched it gently and whispered healing words, and Kyle watched in amazement as the burn faded. He asked if all elves could do magic, and Luna shook her head, and she explained that magic was a gift that ran in certain bloodlines, and her family had been guardians of the ancient forests for thousands of years, and the power came from their connection to the living world. Kyle said that was incredible, and nothing like that existed on Earth. And Luna smiled sadly and said that was because humans had forgotten how to listen to the world, and they had become obsessed with machines and technology and lost touch with the natural order. He wanted to argue, but he knew she was right, and Earth had sacrificed much in its pursuit of progress, and forests had been cut down and oceans polluted and countless species driven to extinction, and maybe that was why the Council had found humans so easy to manipulate. Luna asked what Kyle planned to do when they reached Freeport, and he admitted he had not thought that far ahead, and his entire focus had been on getting them off the prison ship alive. And now that they had succeeded, he needed to figure out what came next. She said that Freeport was dangerous, and it was a haven for criminals and smugglers and people who lived outside council law, and they would need to be careful and trust no one. And Kyle said that sounded perfect because right now, they were criminals too. The council would have already sent out alerts, and their descriptions would be transmitted to every station and outpost in this sector, and they would be hunted, and there would be bounties on their heads. and Kyle knew that turning them in would make someone very rich. But Luna said that Freeport had a reputation for protecting those who paid well, and if they could find work or someone willing to hide them, they might survive long enough to figure out their next move. Kyle asked what her next move would be, and Luna's expression hardened, and she said she needed to return to Etheria and warn her people that the council was planning something terrible, and the arrest had been just the beginning, and soon council forces would invade her world. She explained that the celestial crystals beneath the forest were not just valuable for their energy properties, and they were also the key to something the council called the Genesis Project, and Luna had overheard council scientists discussing it during her imprisonment. The Genesis Project was a plan to terraform worlds and reshape them to council specifications, and entire ecosystems could be rewritten, and planets could be made suitable for colonization in months instead of centuries, and the celestial crystals provided the power needed to make it work. But the process would kill everything on the planet first, and it would strip away all existing life and replace it with council-approved species, and Etheria would be transformed from a forest paradise into a generic colony, world indistinguishable from 1,000 others. Luna's people would be relocated or eliminated, and their culture would be destroyed, and the dragons would be extinct, and 10,000 years of history would be erased, and all for the council's expansion. And Prophet Kyle felt rage building in his chest, and this was exactly the kind of thing he had warned Earth about. And the council did not see people or cultures or living worlds, and they saw only resources to be exploited and obstacles to be removed. Told Luna that he would help her stop them, and together they would find a way to save Etheria. And Luna looked at him with surprise, and she asked why a human would risk everything for an alien world he had never seen. Kyle said because it was the right thing to do, and because if the council succeeded on Etheria, they would do the same to Earth eventually, and because Luna had trusted him enough to let him help her escape, and he would not abandon her now. She reached out and touched his face, gently, and her cool fingers traced the scar above his eyebrow, and she said he was either very brave or very foolish. And Kyle grinned and said probably both Ember and Ash had been sleeping, but now they stirred and their heads lifted and they made a chirping sound that grew urgent, and Luna's expression changed and she said something was wrong. Kyle checked the sensor display and his blood ran cold, and 3 ships had appeared on their scanners, and they were council patrol vessels, and they were closing fast, and someone on the prison transport must have gotten a message out. The escape pod was not designed for combat, and it had no weapons and minimal shielding, and the patrol ships could destroy them with a single shot, and Kyle pushed the engines to maximum but knew it would not be enough. Luna asked if they could make it to Freeport before the ships caught them, and Kyle did the math in his head and shook his head, and they were still 4 hours away, and the patrol ships would overtake them in 20 minutes. She asked if the pod had any weapons at all, and Kyle searched the systems and found one emergency flare launcher, and it was meant for signaling rescue ships not fighting patrol vessels, but it was all they had, dear. Comm system crackled to life, and a voice speaking in perfect English demanded that they shut down their engines and prepare to be boarded, and failure to comply would result in the pod being destroyed. Kyle did not respond, and instead, he adjusted their course slightly and angled toward a nearby asteroid field, and it was dense and dangerous, and no sane pilot would try to navigate it in an escape pod. But they were out of options. Luna saw what he was doing, and she gripped the edge of her seat, and the dragons pressed close to her, sensing the danger, and Kyle pushed the engines harder as the asteroids loomed ahead. The patrol ships followed, and they were gaining, but they were also larger and less maneuverable, and Kyle hoped that would give him an advantage, and he dove into the asteroid field, and immediately rocks began flying past them on all sides. He had to rely on instinct more than instruments, and the pod sensors were barely adequate for tracking the larger asteroids, and smaller rocks appeared without warning, and Kyle threw the pod into sharp turns that made Luna gasp. Behind them, the patrol ships had split up, and they were trying to flank the pod and cut off escape routes, and energy weapons fire lit up the asteroid field as they tried to hit the fleeing vessel. A bolt struck their rear shield, and the pod shuddered and alarms blared, and Kyle saw their shield strength drop to 30%, and one more hit like that, and they would be torn apart. Luna placed her hands on the pod's walls and began chanting, And Kyle felt the temperature inside drop, and frost formed on the windows, and suddenly, the asteroids around them began to move. They were not moving randomly, but with purpose, and large rocks shifted into the path of the pursuing ships, and one patrol vessel had to brake hard to avoid collision, and the other took a glancing blow that sent it spinning. Kyle realized Luna was using her magic to manipulate the asteroids, and she was drawing on whatever water ice existed in the rocks and using it to move them, and it was an incredible display of power that should not have been possible in the vacuum of space. But Luna's face was pale with strain, and blood was trickling from her nose, and Kyle knew she could not keep this up for long, and he needed to find a way out of the asteroid field before she exhausted herself. Ahead he saw a gap in the rocks and a clear path that led toward the outer edge of the field, and he aimed for it and pushed the engines to their absolute limit, and the pod screamed in protest but held together. The patrol ships regrouped and came after them, and they were firing constantly now, and desperate to stop the pod before it escaped and rocks exploded around them as energy bolts turned asteroids into debris clouds. Luna collapsed and her magic failed, and the dragons cried out in distress, and Kyle grabbed her hand and felt how cold it was, and she had given everything she had to buy them those precious minutes. The edge of the asteroid field was ahead, and beyond it Kyle could see the lights of Freeport Station growing larger, and they were going to make it, and against all odds, they were actually going to survive. But the patrol ships were right behind them, and weapons charged for a final killing shot, and Kyle had no moves left and no tricks to pull, and he waited for the end. Then the comm system crackled again, and a new voice spoke, and it was rough and amused, and it said that any ship firing weapons within 10,000 kilometers of Freeport would be considered hostile and would be destroyed. 3 massive defense platforms powered up around the station, and their weapons locked onto the patrol ships, and the council vessels immediately broke off pursuit and veered away. And they knew better than to challenge Freeport's defenses. Kyle guided the pod toward the station's docking bay, and his hands were shaking, and Luna stirred weakly and opened her eyes, and asked if they were safe. And Kyle said yes for now, and she smiled and closed her eyes again. They had made it to Freeport and they were alive and free, but Kyle knew this was just the beginning, and the real fight was still ahead. Freeport Station was unlike anything Kyle had ever seen, and it was a massive, sprawling structure that had been built over centuries from salvaged ships and asteroids and debris from 1,000 different sources. And it looked like chaos given physical form, but somehow it worked. The docking bay was crowded with vessels from across the galaxy, and Kyle saw ships that flew council flags next to pirate raiders and merchant vessels, and everyone seemed to coexist under an unspoken truce, and this was neutral ground where the normal rules did not apply. He helped Luna out of the pod, and she was still weak from using so much magic, and the dragons stayed close to her, making warning sounds at anyone who came near, and Ember's scales glowed brighter. When strangers approached, Kyle knew they needed to find shelter quickly, and they had no money, no identification, and no way to prove who they were. And worse, their faces were probably being broadcast on every wanted list in council space. A docking official approached, and he was a Vorthon, with scales that had faded to gray with age. And he looked at them with sharp, intelligent eyes, and asked for their docking fees and registration codes. Kyle said they had neither. And the official's expression did not change, and he said that was unfortunate, because ships without proper fees were usually impounded, and their crews sent back to wherever they came from. Luna stepped forward despite her exhaustion, and she pulled back her hood, revealing her pointed ears and silver hair, and she said, "They sought sanctuary under the ancient laws," and the official's eyes widened. He asked if she was truly of the elven race, and Luna nodded and showed him the royal crest tattooed on her wrist, and the official made a gesture that Kyle did not understand, but it seemed respectful. And he said that elves were always welcome on Freeport. The old laws still held power here, and Freeport had been founded by refugees from 12 different worlds, and they honored the traditions of sanctuary and protection, and anyone fleeing persecution could find safety here if they could pay, or if they had the right connections. The official told them to follow him, and he led them through corridors that twisted and turned like a maze, and everywhere Kyle looked he saw species he had never encountered, and languages he could not understand, and the air smelled of cooking food and machine oil and things he could not identify. They arrived at a small apartment tucked away in one of the older sections of the station, and the official said they could stay here temporarily, and no one would ask questions, and in return Luna would need to meet with the station's council. In 3 days, Kyle asked what the council wanted, and the official said that elves had not been seen on Freeport in over a century, and the council would want to know why Luna was here, and what she knew about council movements, and knowledge was valuable currency in a place like this. Luna agreed, and the official left, and Kyle helped her to the small bed in the corner, and she collapsed onto it, and the dragons curled up beside her, and within seconds she was asleep. Kyle stood guard while she rested, and he examined their temporary home, and it was sparse with just the bed, a table, and a small food preparation area. But it was clean, and it had a door that locked, and after the prison ship it felt like luxury. Hours passed, and Kyle dozed in a chair while his mind raced with plans, and they needed supplies and information, and most importantly, they needed a way to get Luna back to Etheria before the council launched their invasion. When Luna woke, it was station night, and the lights in the corridor outside had dimmed to simulate darkness, and she looked better, and some color had returned to her face, and she asked Kyle how long she had been asleep. He said about 6 hours, and she needed more rest, but Luna shook her head and said they did not have time for rest, and every hour they delayed was an hour closer to her world's destruction. Kyle agreed, and he told her about the meeting with the station council in 3 days, and Luna said that might actually work in their favor, and councils always had resources and connections, and if they could convince Freeport's leaders that stopping the council served their interests, then they might gain powerful allies. She asked if Kyle had any contacts on the station, and he shook his head. And Earth had only recently learned about Freeport, and no official relations existed, but he said he was good at making friends and figuring out who to trust. They spent the next day exploring the station and learning its layout, and Freeport was divided into districts and each controlled by different factions, and the trade district was run by merchant guilds, and the forge district was controlled by independent shipwrights, and the shadow district was where the less legal activities happened. In the trade district they found an information broker named Catherine Wells, and she was human, which surprised Kyle, and she had come to Freeport 10 years ago after refusing to work for the council's intelligence service. Catherine looked them over with calculating eyes, and she said she knew who they were, and the bounty on their heads was already substantial, and turning them in would make her rich, and Kyle tensed, ready to fight. But Catherine laughed and said she had not survived this long by trusting the council, and she asked what they needed. And Kyle told her everything, and about Etheria and the Genesis project and the need to get Luna home. Catherine listened carefully, and when Kyle finished she was quiet for a long moment. And then she said, the Genesis project was worse than they knew, and the council had been testing it on uninhabited worlds, and the results were catastrophic. Entire ecosystems had been transformed, but the new life was unstable, and planets that should have been paradise colonies were instead dying slowly, and the council was covering it up and destroying evidence, and they needed the celestial crystals to try to fix their failures. If the council got access to Etheria's crystals, they would not just destroy one world, but potentially dozens. As they continued their experiments, and Catherine said this was information worth fighting for. She offered them a deal, and she would help them get to Etheria and arrange transport and supplies. But in return they had to gather proof of the Genesis project's failures and bring it back to Freeport, and that kind of information could bring down council officials and shift the balance of power in the galaxy. Kyle looked at Luna, and she nodded, and they agreed to Catherine's terms, and within hours she had arranged everything, and a ship called the Starlight Runner would take them to Etheria, and its captain owed Catherine several favors. The captain was a grizzled woman named Rachel Torres, and she had been flying the outer systems for 30 years, and she looked at Luna and the dragons with undisguised curiosity, and asked if the legends about dragons were true. Luna smiled and gestured to Ember, who breathed a small jet of flame, and Rachel laughed and said, this would be an interesting trip. They spent the remaining 2 days preparing, and Catherine got them supplies and weapons and false identification that would get them past minor checkpoints, and Kyle practiced with the weapons because he knew they would need to fight before this was over. Luna worked with the dragons, and they were growing fast, and already they were twice the size they had been on the prison ship, and soon they would be large enough to ride. And Luna said that on Etheria they would grow even faster, because the magic there would feed them. on the morning of the third day before their meeting with the council. They boarded the Starlight Runner and Rachel fired up the engines and they left Freeport behind. The journey to Etheria would take 2 weeks and the ship would need to avoid council patrol routes and travel through dangerous territory. But Rachel knew every hidden path and smuggler route in this sector. Kyle stood on the bridge, watching the stars stream past, and Luna joined him. And together, they looked out at the infinite darkness and she said she never thought she would see her home again. He told her they would save Etheria, and they would expose the council's crimes, and they would make sure the galaxy knew what was happening, and Luna said she believed him, and for the first time since her arrest she felt hope. The dragons flew around the cargo bay playing and practicing their flying, and their wings were stronger now, and their flames burned hotter, and Kyle realized they were going to war with 2 baby dragons and an elf princess and a human prisoner, and it should have been impossible. But humans specialized in impossible, and Kyle had proven that when he broke them out of the prison ship, and now he would prove it again when they faced the full might of the Galactic Council. Rachel called back from the pilot seat and said they had just received word that council forces were mobilizing near Etheria, and the invasion was beginning ahead of schedule, and they had maybe 10 days before it was too late. Luna's face went pale, but her eyes blazed with determination, and she said, then they would not waste a single moment, and Kyle agreed, and together, they began planning their assault on an empire, the Starlight Runner flew on through the darkness carrying its unlikely crew toward a battle that would decide the fate of worlds, and somewhere behind them, the Council was mobilizing its forces, and somewhere ahead, Etheria waited unaware that its salvation was coming. Kyle looked at Luna and saw not just an elf princess but a warrior and a friend and someone worth fighting beside, and she looked back at him with the same recognition, and together, they would do the impossible.